I'm really pleased to introduce Jenny, who's going to do, I'm sure, what will be a fascinating talk. So over to you, Jenny, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Judith. I shall just, yes, beginning. Okay, so thank you very much indeed for allowing me to talk about my little munitionettes, who I've been studying and researching since, I think it's 2009 and 2010. I first came up to the Devil's Porridge archive to look at all the amazing photographs that are held in the archives there when it was it was more than a shed, but it was a little tiny building, not the amazing new archive situation that it is now. So this presentation is formed from a part of a chapter of my PhD thesis, which concerned the dress of female munition workers during the First World War. Part of my research looked at the way munitionettes, the nickname for female munition workers, were portrayed and illustrated. As the dress historian Cheryl Buckley stated about wartime fashion, dressing fashionably without recourse to wartime needs became highly contentious, and the female body in particular became a site for a range of tensions around class, nationality and gender. So I'm going to be concentrating on the representations of this tension between fashion and class for this talk, which is going to be organised in the following ways. So firstly, I'm going to look at what happened in the immediate aftermath of the declaration of war to the fashion industry, how the upper classes react to calls for restraint and how this was portrayed in images. Then the discussion will move on to the way in which lower class munition workers were criticised for extravagant spending, highlighting class divisions and the contrary treatment of the different classes. Cartoonists, as Chapman et al. Argue in their book, Comics in the World Wars, reflect the concerns of society in a humorous way to gander morale and poke fun at society's etiquette rules. Cartoons were both critical and, as Pip Gregory has argued, a way to release the tension of the war. I will argue that fashion is a perfect way of demonstrating class, and unlike humour, over time we can still understand these differences. The representations I will be discussing featured mainly in Punch, but I've also included some cartoon postcards from my own First World War postcard collection. The reason for choosing these forms of communication is that they were so prevalent in society at this point. James Taylor has put the circulation of postcards in the billions, whether exchanged as a form of communication or compiled in albums as a collection of interesting or amusing images. Guy de Vries has calculated that at least 30 billion postcards were sent by or received by soldiers on the front over the period of the war, although this figure does not include the domestic market. Punch was a humorous magazine first published in July 1841. In the book A History of Punch, the author R.G.G. Price suggests that Punch was a light-hearted publication. During the First World War, it steered clear of casualty lists, preferring to make jokes about food shortages. Price writes of the popularity of the content of Punch during the war because it recalled Old England. The preposterous nature of class and society were the focus of Punch, which the First World War highlighted. Examples of upper-class ladies playing at being poor or being ridiculed for their preoccupation with pretty clothes will be shown shortly. There was much discussion about the wages women received for their munition work, even though their wages were less than the men's, which had been partly facilitated by the breaking down of processes into less skilled tasks and partly due to the changes in the machinery used in the manufacturing process. By April 1918, the wages of those employed in the national shell factories were for men £4 6 shillings and sixpence a week, with women earning £2 2 shillings and 4pence. In the national projectile factories, men earned an average weekly wage of £4 14 shillings and 8pence, whilst the women earned an average of £2.16 and 8pence, so roughly half of that of the men. However, the cost of living during this period meant that because of wartime inflation, higher wages did not equate to a better standard of living. Peggy Hamilton, who was a middle-class munition worker, wrote a book published in 1917 called 3 Years or the Duration, in which she described her experiences of making munitions at the various factories she worked. The book is a very poignant but strong defence of the munitionettes, and in it she recounts several incidents where assumptions were made by members of the public about the alleged wealth and frivolous expenditure of this group of working women. The illustrations I'm going to share with you this evening would most certainly have cemented these opinions. The day-to-day grind and the struggle that these women had to face in order to buy basic food in between shifts is one that was not addressed by the press. Their hardships were highlighted, however, in a letter from Rose E. Squire, writing to the Principal Lady Inspector after a visit to the Woolwich Arsenal in Woolwich with Mrs. Whitworth on the 26th of October 1917. In her letter a few days later, she wrote that many of the women looked strained and tired. They told us every day was a series of fights which they dreaded. From the time they leave home at 5 or 5:30 until they reach it again at 8 or 9 p.m. A fight and struggle for train, bus, tram or ferry boats jostled and well-nigh killed, and a rush and a long wait in a pushing, surging queue for dinner in the canteen, and again a fight and crush for the evening journey. Sorry. The immediate consequence of the outbreak of war was large-scale unemployment for women, as the sectors of dressmaking and millinery, for example, which traditionally employed women, were badly hit by the loss of trade. Gareth Griffiths states in his book, Women's Factory Work in World War I, that the number of women who were employed full-time, according to official statistics, was 5 million. In September 1914, women's unemployment was recorded at 190,000. This had dropped to 75,000 in December 1914 and 35,000 in February 1915. However, official employment figures relating to women's work should be treated with caution, as they exclude the many women who were also employed within their own homes, taking work in, like, for example, laundry. The number of women taking work in was not regulated or notated because it was frowned upon for a woman to work after marriage, but many working class women needed the extra income, however small. By November 1914, employment for women began to rise again as they found work as clerical or shop assistants. These opportunities had opened up to them before the war, but this was an area of expansion as many initial army volunteers came from these sectors. Ironically, the engineering industry was slow to require replacement manpower. The dichotomy of requiring munitions and men to fight meant that women were eventually seen as a solution. The reluctance to accept this solution was shown primarily in the debates centering on women's physical abilities to carry out men's jobs, despite the physicality of domestic service. One war worker from Southampton recalled earning wages at the age of 16 as a domestic servant of 4 shillings and 2pence a week before the war. A Rosina Wyatt, who worked a 70-hour week in a munition factory in Luton, was paid 30 shillings. Women's average pay was 13 shillings and 6pence per week at the beginning of the war, but by the end, it was between 30 and 35 shillings. But it is necessary, of course, to consider the context of inflation, rent expenditure, etc., before passing judgment on whether or not working class women were financially better off as a result of their war work. Lucy Adlington has usefully contextualized relative clothing costs in her book Great War Fashion, so that a servant earning 10 shillings a week would find the cost of a 6 shilling corset a major outlay, as would a munition worker earning £1 or 12 shillings per week. In 1918, a corset that cost 4 shillings in 1914 had risen in price to 6 shillings and 11 pence. Boots that cost 11 shillings and 6 pence in 1914 were 22 shillings and 4 pence in 1918, and stockings rose from 1 shilling and 8 pence in 1914 to 3 shillings and 5 pence in 1918. So throughout the war, to be seen as dressing in the latest fashion or expensively was seen as this poster directed, unpatriotic, insensitive, etc. Here again, this Punch cartoon depicts the contradiction between the desire to buy luxuries and fripperies and the official government stance encouraging people not to make extravagant purchases. But also note the women in the foreground are wearing furs. So there's this lady, and this lady's got a fur wrap. Postcards, as I have mentioned, used humour and played on the words and concerns of society to poke fun at the difficulties facing the British public during the war. Fashion seems to have been viewed as a relatively harmless conduit for this, because it is seen as a frivolous and trivial extravagance. Here we have the highly contested trope of women wasting money, the sacrifice of the serving soldier, as well as the sexualization of the female body represented by the embarrassed girl and the cheeky wink of the soldier. The jokey tagline of doing without clothes and giving the boys a treat renders the postcard a mischievous humour. Here again, the artist depicts the reaction to and serious effect of rationing and shortages, using fashion to show the ridiculous extremes the shortages could have on fashionable clothing for comic effect. The dress historian Lou Taylor has argued that cartoons are useful as a gauge of period social reaction to dress rather than reliable depiction of style. These next illustrations reflect the discourses about the ends to which the upper classes, who were considered infinitely better educated and well-behaved, engaged with and wore fashionable clothing. They shied away from extravagance for the good of the war effort, allegedly. The Common Cause published a comment in 1916, which said, "But it is not ladies who are buying freely expensive things. In fact, you distinguish the better class people by their very shabby clothes. It is what is known as the factory population, including, of course, the munition workers, and they are not buying sham jewellery, they are buying real furs." Here again, the upper class is stooping to the wearing of rags because economy and fashion is itself the height of fashion. Oh, sorry. And this upper class lady is being made to feel guilty in her furs, whilst the reality is that they are actually, the upper class ladies, being made to look lower class, which I'll come on to speak about shortly. This cartoon is also commenting on the class of the Land Army girls. The assumption that they were from the upper classes is demonstrated by the fact these girls are dressing the scarecrow in their expensive pre-war clothes. The appearance of these women also underlines their wartime roles and the fact that they no longer require garments of this kind. The garment is quite striking in the way it juxtaposes rural nostalgia, items of clothing associated with pre-war society, against the modern appearance of the women wearing trousers. These garments were specifically designed for war work, which would not have been done by this class of women before the war. And so the remainder of this talk will concentrate on what was considered to be war profiting by female munition workers. The reaction to female munition workers' fashionable purchases was class specific. As social historian Angela Woolacott comments, the knowledge that working class women were exercising control over some little extra income made some of the more fortunate classes and various authorities quite uncomfortable. While she acknowledges that these women were indeed making purchases to improve their appearance because of having to mix with other classes, the notions of aspirational dress, whereby the lower classes aspired to ape the manners and dress of their social superiors, were proposed by, most notably, the sociologist Veblen in the late 19th century. But these theories of top-down fashion, as it's been called, have since been reassessed. Historians Claire Cullerton and Angela Woolacott consider that class shame drove some women to make purchases such as stockings and furs in an attempt to fit in with their social superiors. One munition worker, Elsie Mcintyre, who on her promotion to an overlooker, which was a supervisor, began to purchase some items. However, Elsie conceded that she actually purchased cheaper rabbit fur, and the stockings were only silk where they could be seen, with the majority of the leg and foot being wool, as these were within her financial reach. Again, the dress historian Lou Taylor has argued that people dress to fit in with their class, family and friends, rather than for dressing for aspirational reasons, partly, as Elsie admitted, because of financial constraints. Many female munition workers were unmarried, young and still living at home. They were perhaps able to purchase items such as new boots and fur coats, but within the strictures of their environment and finances. Claire Cullerton uses this photograph of a female munition worker wearing a fur collar at work in a Birmingham factory as substantial evidence of the extravagance of female munition workers. This collar does look out of place, but it is difficult to draw any definite conclusions as to the reason this worker chose to wear the collar for the photograph, which may be many and are unclear. We cannot, for example, be sure that the photograph was not staged and the collar was worn for this moment only. The language surrounding particular items, such as the fur coats, was driven by attitudes to class and gender, but historical research to date has not appreciated the complexities of fashion, such as dressing for one's locale and purchasing cheaper products or investment pieces, such as boots. The historian Janet Watson also discusses the wages and the purchases made by female munition workers. She writes that the reaction to munition wages were not usually portrayed as payment for work performed. Instead, they were frequently considered excessive money being spent in a reckless manner on the women workers' bodies, with fur coats, lavish underclothes, and jewellery often given as examples of profligacy. In an article published in John Bull under the headline "Luxury Run Mad," the author accuses munition girls, conductresses, and the soldiers' wives of extravagance in the spending of their enormous incomes, able to find some cheap bargains, really economical, at a fur store in Bayswater. The catalogue is an amazing production. Scores of fur sets are priced, some as cheap as 25 guineas. But the careful housewife can obtain a sable coat at the low price sale of 980 guineas only. The winter price was 1,500 guineas, so the coat is a rare catch for some soldier's wife who does not waste her allotment money. We know that luxury is a taboo nowadays, but such a catalogue makes us wince. Another consideration, as I mentioned, is the quality of items purchased. Lucy Adlington revealed the ways the working class could imitate the more luxurious furs was with the use of velvet and braid. According to the historian Gail Braben, domestic service was the highest employer of unmarried women and young girls, with 1.4 million in service in 1911. It was considered a respectable occupation, one in which girls could be trained in the art of housekeeping, punctuality, cleanliness, and prepare them for motherhood. Servants also added to the status of the household. Those who entered into service were at the behest of the employer, who dictated their wages, working hours, their living conditions, and even their food. Brabourne argues that the demands put on female servants and the lack of respect showed to them by employers made factory and clerical work's regular hours more appealing, offering an escape from domestic drudgery. This cartoon references the problems the upper classes experience finding servants. The wages for domestic servants were on average 10 shillings per week. The hours were long and regular. Many domestic servants left service to work in munition factories, many for the higher wages and regular hours. The cartoon highlights the transfer of the power dynamics between the classes, with the prospective servant setting out her terms of employment. The cartoon on the right reflects the problems the upper classes began to have with servants having more autonomy and confidence. Here, the criticism is aimed at the wages of munition workers. Again, the criticism is narrated through fashion, as the servant wants extra wages in order to be able to dress better, as she feels her appearance and clothing not to be suitable or good enough to walk out with her munition worker gentleman. This cartoon again emphasises the wages servants were earning and the way shopping had developed. Garments could be purchased as ready to wear, making them more accessible to the lower classes. As I mentioned earlier, Veblen argued in 1899 that the lower classes desired that which the upper classes possessed. Therefore, dress became an important signifier of wealth and taste. But this cartoon turns that assumption on its head for comic effect. However, it also contains the discourses around the lower class becoming wealthier. The maid had tried on this very dress and rejected it. The humiliation of the lady of the house not having her dress made by a dressmaker is exacerbated by her lower class maid being able to shop in the same establishment. An article appeared in the Motherwell Times that stated, "As usual, too, the spirit of extravagance is working violently downward. Tom is aping his master, and especially is Mrs. Tom aping her husband's master's wife. The jewellery trade, thought some time ago to be doomed, is booming, several of the factories being unable to cope with the orders that pour in. The fur trade, also thought to be doomed, is likewise booming. The other day, a workman went into a West End shop to buy his wife a 10-guinea fur coat. He was shown one 40 guineas and promptly bought it. His missus must have the best that money could procure. The case typical. Other trades that contribute to luxury and pleasure are reaping golden harvests. Thus do we practice economy in time of war." Profiting from the war became an extremely tasteful outcome of the conflict, and in particular, those involved in munition production were singled out for criticism. Joan Williams, a middle-class munition worker, wrote of her disgust of war profiteers. "You could sympathise with a working girl solely dependent on her earnings, but when you saw a well-fed, well-dressed person obviously all out for what she could make while expecting all the kudos of a war worker, you felt you could not have struck a more sordid job." By 1917, food shortages caused by Germany's blockade on Britain's imports had really started to take effect. Food queues were extremely common, as were food shortages. By the winter of 1917, the war was beginning to take its toll with increasing strikes. Anger grew over high rents, bad housing, and food shortages. Eventually, rationing was introduced for sugar, meat, jam, bread, margarine, and lard in 1918. Partly as a result of the perceived financial motivations of this group of working-class munition workers and factory owners, debates about war profiteering became more vociferous. This cartoon, however, predates accepted opinions that cartoons such as these were reflecting certain debates. And I would suggest that this cartoon demonstrates that war profiting was part of general discourse as early as April 1916. Also note the hyphenated name, the Brown Smiths. So the possibility that the ordinary name has been hyphenated to also indicate how these people are nouveau riche. Those involved in the munitions industry as a whole were ridiculed for their sudden wealth and lack of breeding to know how to handle this new economic freedom. Again, the emphasis here is on the ignorance and extravagance of those with more money than sense. What could be more excessive than A, having enough money to buy an exotic animal, B, to use such an animal as floor covering, and C, having made so much money during a period of national strife? Again, the cartoonist has had fun with the name. The munitionaire, explicitly denoting that this newly fashioned millionaire made his fortune in the munitions industry, and note his fashionably dressed wife complete in fur jacket. However, according to the Hendon and Finchley Times, working people as a rule did not care for banks and investments. They preferred to put something in the house that could in hard times be pawned. In the north, munition workers had added to their standard of comfort in the home and were thrifty. That they were spending the extra money on drink, jewelry and fur coats was to a large extent humbug. Many were buying pianos and sending their children to learn music. A major criticism faced by female munition workers was that their higher wages were being used irresponsibly to purchase expensive items of clothing. And as much of this criticism was class-fueled, it easily lent itself to the satirical humour of Punch. This cartoon shows a munition worker's younger brother wearing unsuitable fashionable boots in which to play football. Here the boots have been drawn as light in colour and with high heels to underline that this pair had not been bought as a practical everyday pair of boots. The suggestion is also that the sister can afford to own more than one pair since working in munitions, so that her brother is able to play a rough and muddy sport in this pair without fearing damaging them. Furthermore, there is the subtle inference of the selfish capriciousness of female munition workers. The sister is spending money on frivolous fashion items for herself when her brother goes without suitable footwear. But working class women joined boot clubs as a way to save up for replacement boots and only bought new pairs when they were past the point of mending. Boot clubs were written about by Maud Pember-Reeves in her study of the working class in the East End of London at the beginning of the 20th century. Each week, a sum of money would be paid into a savings scheme to spread the cost of the purchase. She also describes poorer women packing boots with newspaper to plug holes in the soles, or even shopping in the evening so as to hide the fact they were wearing slippers, as did a certain Mrs. O. The First World War criticism of these women did not actually take into account that they were able for the first time to invest in a practical, essential item. This criticism could have also been fueled by an older generation who could see traditional values and boundaries being questioned and changed. The fact that these working class women were seen to be exercising autonomy over their lives because of their financial independence was deemed threatening to established gendered and class identities. Amy Elizabeth May recalled how she gave her mother some of her extra wages and then spent some on clothes. I had a nice costume, a two-piece, a nice coat. I was quite proud of my clothes, I was. A pair of boots, but I always had fat legs and these blessed boots. I could never get a pair of boots to lace together like some other girls. And this pair, I think they were £4. And that was a price for them in those days, and the blessed thing split up the back. So I took them back and they said, oh, well, we'll do what we can. And they put a strip up the back and it turned me right off them. Most of the women would have been struggling with family finances and would have spent their money basically on rent, food, heating and clothes for their families, and not, as the propaganda of the time suggested, on fripperies. Younger women, as was the tradition, handed almost all their wages to their mothers. As I mentioned in the very beginning of this talk, there was a huge amount of discussion about class, which the fur coat came to embody. So while the frayed coat became a badge of patriotism, the fur coat changed from signifying wealth and status to one of ill-gotten gain. In the Sheffield Evening Telegraph, they asked, why in heaven's name should not Munition girl have fur coat as well as any other girl if she can pay for it? The flaw in this line of thought is that no girl has any right to buy furs now, especially if she can pay for them. We cannot blame the munition girl any more than we blame the daughter of a munition magnate, neither blame her any less. Extravagance in clothing is just now wrong. In the Pall Mall Gazette, they wrote, as regards dress, the extravagance of the women is appallingly in evidence. They themselves admit it, and the advertisements to tempt them get more rampant with every week. A 25 guinea fur coat seems to be the latest indispensable for a lady clerk, while her employer has to go about with his knees to his old trousers for fear of being thought disloyal by ordering a new pair. Our servants or maids, as they prefer to be called, have all left us for munitions or army pay officers and are nobly working for their country at tremendous pay. Our soldiers, God bless them, are fighting for us at a shilling a day, not always paid up promptly, and third-rate mechanics at home are making £8 and £10 a week. What a glorious reign of topsy-turvydom. The Irish Independent wrote about extravagance at Woolwich. In connection with the munition works at Woolwich, a London Sunday paper remarks that the second-hand shops now display silken costumes from £3 and 10 shillings to £5 and 5 shillings. Manicure sets from 18 shillings to 30 shillings sell rapidly, and boots at 32 shillings and sixpence are displayed in every boot shop. On the hoardings are warnings against extravagance. The trope of fur coats and female munition workers profiting from the war is reiterated here. These two cartoon postcards powerfully link munition work with high wages. The artist Reg Morris has used the rhyme to underline the connection between the snooty-looking ladies stepping out of the taxi, wearing fur-trimmed coat and carrying a fur muff, with munition pay, which has allowed her to dress seemingly as a duchess. The postcard by the same artist on the right, I hear you're doing well at shell making, is equally direct in its association, with the artist having refashioned the snooty pose and fur-trimmed garments of the duchess onto the hen. Here, the metaphor of the hen has been used to underline the numbers of women involved in munition production and the implication that many female munition workers were benefiting from the spoils of their work. One subtle theme in both of these postcards is the independence of women. They are depicted as stepping out on their own. Perhaps the concern over women becoming spendthrifts was also to do with this independence. So this slide shows a male munition worker discussing the fact that he's bought a piano, but that he can't afford to play it, but he's bought it as an ornament, effectively, an expensive one. And in the Motherwell Times also reiterates this little story that I featured on the slide from the Daily Mirror. They wrote, the other day in a Midland town, a workman entered a piano shop and in an offhand way bought an instrument for £35. Next day he was backed for a second, just to fill a vacant space in his parlour. Neither he nor his family could play a note, but he wanted impressive ornaments, and to a munition worker, what is a paltry £70? And I've chosen this cartoon because even when the focus of the cartoon is not on the munitionette, we can clearly see that in the background there is a well-dressed female munition worker in the latest fashion, including a fur-trimmed coat. An article in the Bystander even called fur coats munition overalls. These discourses penetrated the public's perception of spendthrift working-class female munition workers. The accusation was that fur coats were now worn widely by female munition workers because they earned so much that they could afford to wear them at work. What had been an expensive and unaffordable luxury item of clothing now began to be associated with the working classes. Female munition workers were seen to be attempting to impersonate the upper classes, resulting in the fur coat becoming a metaphor for tasteless showing off. Profiting, considered a byproduct of the war, was deemed distasteful and class-based, but it also demonstrated that the lower classes and munition company owners were seen as insensitive to the sacrifices and hardships being suffered by many in the country. Cartoons depicted the ways in which these newly wealthy individuals apparently tried to purchase goods in order to elevate their position. In this cartoon, Recognition at Burlington House, which is the site of the Royal College of Art in London, two munition workers admired Stanhope Forbes' oil painting of the interior of a munition factory, which was painted in 1918. The two women have been drawn in fashionable clothing, but their class is betrayed by their dialect. Upon realizing they knew one of the subjects within the painting, the two girls are instantly identified as working class, and so the viewer is left to make negative conclusions about their extravagant clothing. The writer, Mrs. Alec Tweedy, commented in her book that tawdry finery is the hallmark of the usual working class girl. And the artist of this drawing made use of the character's lack of etiquette to expose their true class. As Angela Woollicott has noted, the image of a munition woman in a fur coat was the antithesis to wartime sacrifice and demonstrated a lack of understanding for their social position. Moreover, she argues that these accusations stemmed back to Victorian interpretations of the fallen woman, and that by wearing expensive garments, these working class female munition workers were thus behaving like prostitutes. Articles in newspapers appeared expressing the distasteful, ubiquitous extravagance by these highly paid female munition workers, and as Woollicott has argued, this was cased in terms of class. The criticism was vociferous, admonishing the women for attempting to stray out of their class and dressing unbecomingly. As a journalist wrote in an article in the Shields Daily News, the sudden possession of large sums of money has caused female munition workers, especially the single ones, to adopt a style of dress quite out of keeping with their social position. A fur coat and a blunted vocabulary are misfits. So this cartoon was published in a souvenir edition of the Dornoch Times, which was a factory magazine for Gretna. And I've chosen it as it perfectly communicates how fashion was used to articulate the way in which the war had been believed to be of benefit to female munition workers. The munition worker is seen arriving at the factory in Gretna, fashionably dressed. And then she's pictured leaving in 1919, laden with shopping bags. It seems strange that such a critical depiction would have been included in a magazine published for and by the workers at the government-controlled munition factory at Gretna. It may be acknowledging that the women were financially better off, but it could even be read as a rueful comment on the assumption that all the women were concerned with was short-term financial gain and criticising the unwise purchases of female munition workers by wasting their money on fashion. Female munition workers were morally encouraged to leave their well-paid factory jobs for the returning soldiers and were expected to return to domestic service. But so often were articles printed regarding female munition workers wearing fur coats that the two became synonymous with the working class profiting from war work. Descriptions emphasised the exorbitant cost of items. For example, a single sentence in the Coventry Evening Telegraph reflects on the Sunday wear of a munition girl from Liverpool, consisting of a fur coat costing 30 guineas and high-heeled boots 45 shillings. In the Dundee Courier, a 1918 article titled "Dundee Dundee unemployed women come in furs and draw out of work pay. Strong criticism of ex-munition workers. Express with disdain the attitude of munitionettes. The article reported one ex-munition worker as saying that I made £3.10 a week when I was on munitions, and any old job won't do now. Would you believe it? I was asked the other day if I would take service in a house. What the wages? I asked. £30 for a whole year? Not me. The disparaging criticism voiced in this article towards these women who did not wish to return to service below stairs was vociferous. But the fact the article goes on to describe how prevalent fur coats were within this group of working class women is ironic, when on the same page, this advertisement for fur coats appeared, showing the contradictions evident, but also underlining the subliminal association. The sociologist Diana Crane sees the buying and wearing of better clothes as a reaction to the unattractive uniforms and a means of participating in and feeling part of the community outside of work. Crane sees it as a way of women claiming their own identity more so than claiming a higher status. The trope of the munitionette having squandered her unseemly high wages on fashionable furs spoke of wider disgust of those who had apparently profited from the war. It also conveyed a certain class prejudice against working class vulgarity, even though those in the fancy drapery trade had themselves benefited from this trade. The journalist interviewed a woman who has much to do with the munition workers, said that while a very large number of girls had nearly put all they earned on their back, their heads and their feet, dressed in the height of fashion they are, she said. Go down the labour exchange when the out of work money is being paid and you'll see for yourself. It's changed days for Dundee when unemployed women trip down in their furs and jewels to draw idle pay. The Courier representative did visit the labour exchange, and out of every 10 women whom he saw enter the premises, 8 were wearing furs. On numerous occasions, Peggy Hamilton defended her fellow munition workers in her book. She describes both the physical and economic hardships they had to suffer, and recounting an exchange with another middle-class lodger in her digs, she wrote, I think it's disgraceful, all these munition workers and their fur coats, they're getting too much money. I told her that I was a munition worker, that no one I knew owned a fur coat, that we worked from 7 to 7, 6 days a week for £1 a week, and what sort of fur coat did she think she could buy after paying for her living out of that? It's more than they ever had before, she said, and they don't know how to spend it. And do the rich always know how to spend their money, I asked. It's nothing to do with the poor how the rich spend their money, she answered. Well, it's nothing to do with the rich how the poor spend their money either. The wages the women received depended on the job they carried out, and sometimes the women had to pay some of their wages to the skilled engineer who set out their tools. Then there would have been considerations for rent and travel, family responsibilities, food and clothing. Deborah Tom writes that the wages during the war averaged about 30 shillings a week. Conversely, the same wages prior to the war would have been about 11 and 6 a week. But this figure does not take into account overtime or piecework, whereby the workers were paid by the number of items produced in a given time. Again, using Peggy Hamilton's memoir, she writes emphatically of the struggles and critical assumptions made of female munition workers, recalling most of her wages did in fact go on rent and not clothes. Once she and a friend had to pawn some trinkets in order to pay for tickets home, and in what seems to be typical of the time, people were not afraid to voice their opinions about shirkers. The pawnbroker told the girls they ought to be ashamed of themselves for not earning. I'm shocked that a pair of strapping girls like you should be reduced to coming into a shop like mine, he said sharply. Pull yourselves together, there's plenty of work around these days. Thus, there was evidently little public understanding of the hardships and what in reality were low wages. Middle-class supervisors received higher wages than those who worked the machines, and the women working in the filling shops who worked with TNT also received higher wages than other factory women. But these criticisms of the high wages received by female munition workers neglected to consider the dangers they faced. Fur coats and boots were considered to be expensive items and were easily recognisable cultural shorthand for the irresponsible financial behaviour of female munition workers. But the purchasing of these items was also deemed to be demonstrative of the ignorance of the working class, that in a time of sacrifice and national need, substantial sums of money were being wasted on the fashionable trivialities. As Jonathan Fryers has argued, extravagance in dress by the lower classes had associations with prostitution, and so the fur coat transformed from a signifier of wealth to one associated with immoral activities over the course of the First World War. The inclusion and repetition of certain themes across differing forms of representations acknowledge these recognised discourses. The fact artists chose to illustrate female munition workers demonstrates how they were a major part of public discourse at the time. The reality was that whilst munitionettes were considered patriotic and essential to the war effort, they were simultaneously criticised for their appearance, behaviour, and the morals that were embodied in the wearing of fur coats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. That was excellent, really interesting.
Thank you.
And I think we've got a couple of questions coming in already, and I'm sure there'll be some more. Let me go back. So we've got Morag made the comment, which was that the girl with the fur, the white sort of collar, looks like she's trying not to laugh. It looks like she's doing it for a joke. It was interesting that she's the only one wearing white as well as the fur collar. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, it could be that. I wouldn't necessarily put much sort of emphasis on the fact that she was wearing white, because sometimes they did have different colours for the responsibility they had, but also in certain other factories they weren't given the uniforms, so they bought them from shops, or I mean there could be a load of, so there could be other reasons why she was wearing a different colour.
And do you think she was maybe she'd put it on for a joke, like maybe she was playing up to the idea of that they all wear fur all the time and just idle around?
It could have been. I mean, as well, when I first saw it, I thought it was really odd because fur is really flammable. And again, I mean, it depends on what sort of factory and what they were making within their factory. But I mean, that sort of thing would definitely not have been allowed in a factory where they were handling explosives like Gretna for the safety reasons. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about the putting it on for a joke. I mean, yes, I thought that she might have been dressing up for the camera, but we'll never know because there's nothing written on the back or.
We've got a photograph in the museum collection, and it's a group of chemists, and they're all posing with bits of like bones, human bones.
Okay.
And I assume because one's holding a skull and one's holding like a vertebrae. I'm assuming that it might be a prop or something like that, but you don't know why people take photographs and what macabre joke that was. They look like they think it's funny, not creepy and weird.
Well, it could, if you think about the manufacturing process for gelatin, they use bones for that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it could just be it could be a lot of them were doctors. It could be doctor humor,
and a lot of the photographs that you have in the archive might have been used within the production of the factory magazines. So it could have been for, I don't know, a skit or a play or something like that they've been doing, or like you say, it could be just.
You just don't know, do you? Once the context's lost, it's quite hard to know what went on. I'm sure it always happens when someone's outed us or whatever, you can find a photo of them looking fantastic and great, or you can find a photo of someone looking psychotic and evil. It's quite easy to edit it depending on which photograph how you want to portray the person. So there's a question from Pat. How many weeks' wages would a fur coat have cost?
Well, that's the thing. I think I said right at the beginning, didn't I? I mean, it's difficult to say because it depends on their other expenses. But you could get cheaper fur coats, but again, it depends on the quality. And what I haven't found out, which I would love to find out, is if there was a second-hand market. So, or they could have been hand-me-downs as well. I mean, that's the thing about them investing in these fur coats. They would have. My gran had fur coats that have been left to her by people. So, yeah, it's really difficult to say. I mean, some I don't know how some of the things were exaggerated. Just to prove a point, so they would have gone to the high-end shops. I'm trying to look back now. I mean, when they're talking guineas, I mean, that was completely out of the price range for these workers. But yeah, I mean, if a pair of boots cost £4 and they were on, so Peggy Hamilton writes that she was on £1 a week, but she was a middle-class munitions worker. So obviously it would have taken her quite some time to save up for that. But then she didn't work in the danger rooms, which is where they actually filled the shells with the TNT, and they were called danger rooms because it was of the danger there. And they were the ones who got the substantially higher wages. But along with that came other illnesses and side effects. So they became known as the Canary Girls because the TNT turned their skin yellow because it attacked their liver. And they would have been seen in public with their skin discoloration and would have been, I don't know if they were mocked, but they were definitely, there was this contradiction between being praised for their contribution to the war effort and the dangerous work they did, but also they were identified as working class and going there for the money by their skin colour, so they were criticised at the same time. But again, I think in the cordite factory, they used to chew the gun cotton, which is like the cotton wool that was soaked in the chemicals, because it tasted sweet, but that used to cause all sorts of problems. And I think sometimes the chemicals would have made them feel drowsy or appear drunk, so they get accused again of drinking. And there were lots of stories in the Carlisle newspapers about the problems of drunken munitionettes from coming from Gretna up to Carlisle to. So
it certainly seems like I mean, well, I'm sure we could all get on our bandwagons about, or our soapboxes about, you know, it seems like whatever the young women did, they got criticised quite a lot. You know, if they were dressing like men in their trousers and munitions for work, it's sort of like it's too masculine. If it's they're getting their skins discolored because they're doing dangerous and necessary work, they're criticised. If they're spending money that they've earned on things that they want, they're criticised. It just seems, you know, that's the way of the world. And that sort of leads into Peter's comment, which is when you were showing that picture from the Dawn at Farewell magazine, it reminded me of another document in the museum collection, which was a document written by an anonymous author who said he'd worked, I'm assuming it's a he, that they had worked and watched the munition workers closely, and he'd drawn up a list of positives and negatives of women working. And one of the negatives was that a lot of them have home calls that they can't deny, that they have to go and look after children or elderly parents or things like that. And it's not really something that you see in that picture. It seems like they just earned their money and spent it on hats and maids and things like that. And Peter says there seems to be a big difference between a munitions worker wearing furs and a munition worker being prosecuted for stealing a pullover because they were so cold, which I think is a case that was connected with HM Factory Gretna.
I mean, that's it. There is a there is a big difference, but that where at the beginning of the war, when they first got involved in munitions work, there's lots of propaganda books and articles in newspapers to counteract the actual evidence of TNT poisoning. So they were talking about it didn't affect their appearance at all, and they all looked young, healthy and well, and they weren't tired. And so the fact that somebody got prosecuted for stealing a pullover because of a cold would not have gone with that narrative of, well, of anything really. I mean, even in Gretna, it wouldn't have fitted in with there was a lot of antagonism between the classes of the women, but also the sexes. So they were trying all the time to build a unified workforce. So things like the pullover, they would have probably pushed under the carpet to a certain extent. I mean, there were, if you do look, you can see little snippets, but they would never have illustrated that because it didn't fit in with the humor maybe, or you're not going to make someone look funny in that kind of situation, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we were talking about this earlier on, Jenny and myself, about like in the Dornoch Farewell magazine, it does stand out, that picture, because it does seem critical of the female workers, whereas the general tone of it is everyone's in it together, we all got on so well, the girls were fantastic, very much like that. So that actually kind of leads on to I'll go through the questions in order or confuse myself. So Pat asks, did most collars have a metal fastening, which probably wouldn't have been allowed anyway in most of the factories?
So on the actual sort of workwear that they had, they were either fastened with buttons, or I've got photographs of some of the uniform that was handed out at Gretna. They were done up with little bows that were made up. It looks like a kind of worsted, woolly type, really thick fabric that they wore at Gretna, partly to help against protection against the cold. So yeah, in the factories where they were filling shells with the explosive materials, chemicals, they would not have had any metal fastenings. In Gretna, they were given, I think they were called sand shoes. They looked like rubber shoes, or they had wooden soles, so that they couldn't cause sparks. They had to remove, the women had to remove any hairpins, and they also weren't allowed to have wear their stays, so their corsets, because they had metal in them. So that led to some people creating corsets for munition workers, but I haven't come across any actual objects, so I don't know if the corsets were made without any sort of metal in them.
Well, Pat's clarifying that she meant the fur collars, but I think that is what you're talking about, that they were fastened with buttons and things like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the other thing is that certain factories would have been less strict, because the munitions industry was split into segments. So you'd have factories that made the metal components, and then you'd have the shells where they were made would then be transferred to filling factories. So some places that say made cartridges or little tiny parts of the ammunition, so just the shells, they would have not, the regulations wouldn't have been so strict. And I suspect the one of the fur collar, it looks like they're just filling.
Yeah, they look like they're doing drilling or something, didn't they?
Yeah.
Or something like that, yeah.
So yeah, maybe it didn't have.
That's such an interesting thing about the someone's commented that that someone had Peter has said that they had a whalebone corset. That's such an interesting thing about the underwear, because Taff, who did the talk last month about the Great War Huts, they're having an exhibition on underwear in wartime, and that's such an interesting account. I wonder if they've managed to track down an example of a Munition Girls corset. That would be brilliant.
Well, the whalebone was down the sort of middle and sewn in, but then down the front, they used to have some, this isn't all corsets, but they used to have like a metal, it was almost like a metal button or a stud, and then there was a loop that was also metal that fastened over it. But that's obviously only one type. There would have been many types. But yeah, there was lots of criticism about them, the lack of respectability because they weren't wearing their proper correct underwear, and that's obviously associated with loose women. And there's lots of cartoons about the fact that they're not wearing stays, but they're in shifts, or they're not in shifts. So there's
oh, they seem to have had a whale of a time with that joke, don't they? I think we've got about 10 or 20 different comic sort of pictures where it's, we're going to work, munition workers work in shifts and they're wearing their nightie and, you know, that sort of thing. Lots of bucks and wenches. So there's a question for you, a comment from Ali or Ali, sorry. So it's a very good point. There's lots of criticism of women earning high money and frittering it away. Were men criticised for earning a good wage? And
yes, they were. I mean, I've just looked at women, but there's the piano, the munitioner buying the piano, and there's lots of things in Punch about the men going in to buy food and not understanding what salmon was, or whether certain, like a side of salmon, if that was expensive or not, and then they just buy it, or and the fact that we are getting a biased view because that was society at the time. And the problem with the cartoons is that a lot of times the cartoons on postcards, they were drawn and illustrated by certain famous, as they've now become, cartoonists. So we know who they are, and that they were, in the majority of cases, were male. But in the factory magazines, there was a fashion for them just putting their initials underneath the cartoon, the illustration, and so you can't tell from that whether they were men or women. I suspect that some of, I mean, this is a big generalization, that many of them could have been drawn by men, because I've got one magazine from another Scottish factory called the Georgetown Gazette, and there's a cartoon in there. It's silhouettes of munitionettes in various poses. They're dancing, they're sipping tea, they're smoking, they're walking a dog, and it's got the initials of the artist, but in the editor's note at the beginning of the edition, it actually thanks a certain man who worked in the drawings department. So I do wonder if the people who were doing the drawings, because of their artistic skills, possibly did carry out and contribute a lot of the cartoons. But again, because they signed them with their initials, I can't be sure. It's just an assumption.
Yeah, I think that certainly from a Gretna perspective, the majority of the documents are written from a male perspective, but you do get the odd female voices, the odd poem, and there's the odd bit in an autograph book and things like that. But we've got a lot more images of women, a lot of them used for propaganda purposes, and a lot less of the voices of the women, I think, than you would like to see from a modern perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is it's the power and the hierarchy. So the factory structure reflected the structure of society. So the people in power who had the voices were either upper class and male, or the welfare, the women who looked after who were again upper class.
Yeah, I often find myself saying things, particularly when I'm talking to schools or visitors. You talk about the workers, but actually it's more like the staff and the workers, isn't there? And like a lot of the magazines are more like the staff magazines than actually the general labouring workforce. So Jane says, my gran was born in 1897 and worked in a munitions factory in the London area. By the time she had paid her lodgings and food, she had almost no spare money. Yeah, that's probably very common. And a bit more about corsets, and then Pat's saying she's might know that Taff might know about soldiers' underwear. That's true. And Elaine saying, as you've made clear, Jenny, it's as much about the lower classes getting uppity as it is about the high wages. And I think it's that class, money, and women mixed in as well. It's sort of all piling in on each other there and making it into a big social issue.
Well, I think at that time as well, it was all about knowing your position in society. The class structure was very much identified, and you didn't venture out of it. And by using dress, you were showing yourself to think that you were above your own station, or better than you actually were, I suppose.
Yeah, it's very contradictory, isn't it? I mean, I know it's general, but people are supposed to make the best themselves, make the most of their life, but not too much. Like there's always the glass ceiling, there's always the thing that you need to sort of restrain people. Oh, we've got interest in the underwear exhibition from Sandra. It does sound really good. I was going to try and see if we can maybe get it on loan to the Devil's Porridge Museum. It's going to be at the Great War Huts, which I think I want to say Suffolk, but I might be Sussex. I think it's Suffolk. If you look for Great War Huts, it's a really brilliant thing. We've actually got a talk about it on our YouTube channel. And so someone asked at the very beginning, if you've got more questions, now's the time to pop it in the chat. But someone asked at the very beginning, all the way from New York, what is the Devil's Porridge Museum? So I'll just answer that quickly. So the Devil's Porridge Museum tells the story of HM Factory Gretna in World War I, which was the largest munitions factory at the time in Britain, and it made something called cordite, which is a propellant which goes inside shells and bullets that were used in the war. And when cordite is in its raw form, when it's in its completed form, it looks like cords, hence the name. It looks like shoestrings or shoelaces. Cordite. When it's in its raw form, it's white and lumpy and bumpy and mixed in big pots, which when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle saw it in Scotland, he said it looked like porridge, but not the nice kind that you eat, but the devilish kind that blasts the Huns to hell, as he described it. So it's made of acidic, all sorts of horrible chemicals that make it explosive. So that's a brief description of what the Devil's Porridge Museum is. It started 25 years ago as a display in the back of the church, and it's now a 5-star museum. So come and visit us if you've not been before, and we'd be very happy to see you there. So thanks, Pat, for sharing that. Great War Huts. Yeah, they're going to have an exhibition there at some point in the future. I'm not entirely sure when, but I'm sure their website will be kept up to date with it. And I'll let people, you can still put questions in and interrupt me, but I wanted to just say thank you so much to Jenny for that talk. It was really eye-opening, thought-provoking, and beautifully illustrated as well. Some amazing little cartoons there and things like that. It's really interesting to see the problems that people faced, because we've the museum were so focused on the work that they did and thinking about the sort of attitudes that they encountered and the prejudices and experiences. It's a really different area of the war for us all to think about. And now we look back, and certainly with the 2018 representation of the people, sort of centenary of, you know, women getting the vote, it was all very celebratory. And actually to see that they were encountering sort of, you know, that level of criticism based on class and gender is really, really important to bear that in mind. So thank you very much for your talk this evening. I really enjoyed it.